I was up late last night listening to Dan Senor interview Haviv Rettig Gur from Jerusalem, and it is quite obvious to me that, and I hope you listen for yourself to Dan Senor's podcast. He's going to join me tomorrow to talk about his new book, The Miracle of Israel. The Genius of Israel is the name of the new book. It came out before, of course, 10/7. It was finished before 10/7. But since 10/7, he's been interviewing quite a few people on the ground, including this revelation to me. We like Dr. Orrin. We talk to Dr. Orrin as often as possible. And I don't think anyone is as informed as Dr. Orrin, but Haviv Rettig Gur, who works for the Times of Israel, is about as close. And Dan dropped a pod last night at 11:30. And instead of going to bed, I listened to it and stayed awake because I am quite intent and focused on the war, because it is not a war of Israel against Hamas. It's a war of the West against barbarism, and we need to win it. By we, I mean the Israelis are doing the fighting. We've got to get them everything they need. And Haviv Rettig Gur last night explained, and it was completely gripping, that the so-called pressure from the West is doing nothing except turning Israeli resolve to finish Hamas into iron, into steel. That the so-called pressure and the marches are just telling Israel that they've got to look to their own men and women, their own resilience, and whatever friends they have in the West, and this show is one of them, and the Republican Party is certainly one of them. I think you saw the debate last week with the Republican Jewish Coalition, and blow off everybody else. And they're doing it. They're not going to be deterred. They're not for turning. So yesterday, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, about whom I was wrong, I had some hope he would be competent. He's not. He went on the Sunday shows yesterday and urged Israel to avoid firefights in hospitals. You know what that does? All that does is encourage Hamas to erroneously believe that Israel will not attack them in the hospitals. So they stay in the hospitals and they keep people hostage in the hospitals. And it's just another example of a feckless, incoherent, confused Biden administration. They go from full-throated support for Israel to don't fight in the hospitals. It's incoherent. And Israel doesn't care anyway. And if anybody in the Biden administration breathes a word against Israel, that will shatter the Democratic Party forever. As it is, I think a realignment among friends of Israel is happening in real time. Let me run down the news for you this morning. Tragic story. 5 members of the U.S. Army Special Operations Forces died in a helicopter crash in the Med. An MH-60 Black Hawk went down. So today is my extension of Veterans Day. It's also a day of remembrance for these 5, I don't know if they're soldiers or airmen or Delta, or I have no idea, hadn't been released. But I do know that it's a dangerous world, and they've been serving their country. I'm going to spend half the show, like the second half of each hour, talking with some veterans of the Long War and how the Sempre Fi Fund and America's Fund, the fund.org, have helped them to complete the show I began on Friday, because Veterans Day came on Saturday, which is rare. I normally devote one whole show to it. Instead, I devote half the show on Friday and half the show on Monday, because I want to make sure you're up to date in the middle of a war on all the news. So that will come up at the bottom of the hour. U.S. airstrikes killed Iranian proxies in Syria. We're not going to take it. More than 50 Americans, I mentioned this on Friday, more than 50 Americans have been wounded by attacks from Iranians in their proxies in the Middle East in the last 6 weeks. And finally, DOD has taken the gloves off. Israel has announced a sharp drop in the rocket and drone attack warnings from the south. And that's because they're being destroyed. Hamas is being methodically reduced. Hamas and the UN say that patients, health workers, and displaced have left Shifa Hospital. So good. They're allowing more than 200,000 people have gone from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, because Israel is fighting a war according to the laws of armed combat. And that doesn't mean that hostages work. It just means that you try and minimize civilian casualties, and they are. Hamas has appeared to rule out a partial prisoner exchange. Yesterday, President Biden revealed in a readout, not directly, that one of the hostages is a 3-year-old American toddler both of whose parents were killed. on 10/7. Did you know that? The Jake Sullivan story is in my. I've already told you about it. What I did not tell you about is a story from the Jerusalem Post. Hamas planned to push the October 7 massacre to the West Bank border. So if you don't have a map in your mind, think of the West Bank as being Indiana and Gaza as being Pennsylvania. It's not that far, but they're going to go from Pennsylvania, break through the fence, and maraud across Lower Lake Erie all the way to Indiana, and they got halfway there. Now, the distances are different, but that gives you the sense. They didn't get where they were going to go. The Israeli Defense Forces rallied, and the police and the border services rallied, and the Israeli civilians who are armed rallied, and they killed 1,500 terrorists, but 1,200 Israelis were dead, and 230 were carried away before the terrorists were stopped. But their original plan would have hit major Israeli cities, IDF bases, and they had alerted terrorist cells in the West Bank, which did not activate because they did not get there. 1,600 Jewish alumni have demanded Harvard crack down on anti-Semitism in a scathing letter. I want you to know that FoxNews.com has become a silo. You can find it. I've tweeted it out over on X, reposted a link to the silo at FoxNews.com that collects all the stories about anti-Semitism in the United States and the world. Very, very useful. And these 1,600 Jewish alumni of Harvard, I wish they'd circulated it to everyone. You don't have to be a Jew to think that the anti-Semitism at Harvard is the most disgusting thing I've seen in the 49 years I've been associated with the college. It's just disgusting, and the president of Harvard should quit, and the board of trustees should quit, and Columbia and Princeton and Cornell and everywhere else where it's broken out, all of you should quit. Get out. You cannot fix the problem. Hadn't happened at Chapman. Of course, it hadn't happened at Hillsdale. Hasn't happened anywhere that has good administrators. Yesterday, President Biden, or actually, I think it was on Friday, the president got lost at Arlington at the Unknown Soldiers ceremony. And it's very sad. The president is infirm, and he did not know where to go. And it happens all the time. It is not funny. We are on the cusp of a major, major confrontation with our enemies in the Middle East. And this is not funny. It also reports, by the way, that 14% of U.S. voters say Joe Biden has made them better off. Only 14%. I don't know who those 14% are. They must be government workers. They must be union, public employee union people, because nobody's better off with this inflation. Senator Scott dropped out of the presidential race, so now there are 4 left, other than the former president, 4 trying to match up against Donald Trump. Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, and Vivek. Vivek's not a serious candidate. I'm happy to have him on and talk to him. He's actually taking votes away from President Trump. He's kind of trying to be a Pete Buttigieg figure, and he's at 4%. I don't think he's going to make the next debate stage. I do believe Christie, Haley, and DeSantis will make the next debate stage, which will be a News Nation debate, along with Megyn Kelly and Eliana Johnson. And I hope they have good production values. I'm very gratified by the general reaction of the debate last week, which was surprise and amazement that NBC News could put on a good debate. I like to think I contributed to that in the 2 weeks of preparation that we did, but they're professionals, and they knew that it was for the Republican. They got it right. It was for the Republican primary audience. It's also only 5 people. It's a lot easier to manage than 8. Certainly easier to manage than 13 to make sure everyone got. And Ronna McDaniel and David Bossie pushed for, and NBC adopted the 90-second rule with no right of reply, which makes for a much more coherent debate. Much more. 90 seconds is adequate to answer a question. And if someone is driven over your foot, you can bring that up in the course of 90 seconds. My subtext over at the universe is full of people and their comments, and I'm methodically going through them and reading them all. In the event I get called out of the bullpen again, you can always improve. You can always improve on a debate. But that was the best debate I think we've seen in presidential primary debates in 8 years. Because, again, rehearsal, anticipation. It's not about the moderators, it's about the candidates. And we only had 5. The next one will probably only have 3. Unless the former president comes. But 3 or 4, you can have a great debate. You can have a great debate. And Republicans will have a choice to make. And I'm Switzerland, and they're all welcome here.